All right, let's talk about privilege. I know just saying that word, like people immediately get thrown into some kind of thought about it because, well, and here's what I'll say is it makes a lot of sense because the way that that term has been used for so long, particularly in the race conversation, has just been in terms, excuse me, of white privilege, which, as people hear that term in our day and age, they connect white privilege to this idea of some kind of villainy, right? Like there's some sort of immorality. If you were to say, hey, you're benefiting from white privilege, they think you're saying that they're immoral, that they're a villain, things of that nature. But what I want to do today is kind of try to neutralize it, not only to neutralize the term privilege to some extent, but also just think about what it looks like to steward whatever privilege that we have. So privilege, I think about like my own sort of experience with privilege. I remember the first time I went to Africa, and we ended up in Rwanda. And I remember walking around the streets and seeing everywhere I looked, I saw people who looked like me. And I saw them on billboards. I saw them in TV shows. I saw even mannequins, like in the store windows. The mannequins in Kigali were black mannequins. And a funny story that I remember from that is we went into the bank to get some money, to exchange some money. And we're in the bank, and there's all these pictures on the wall of families, you know what I mean, in the bank. And so these families are, of course, black families. And then they had kind of this like column in the middle. You know, if you're in a room or something, there's a column in the middle. It's usually load bearing or something like that. And on the column, they had posted this picture for cyber theft and our cybersecurity. And it was a picture of a person who had one of those like baklavas on, you know what I mean? The stocking caps that only give you the eyes and the mouth. And if you look closely at the eyes and the mouth, the part of the skin that you saw was white skin around it. It was so funny. It was like the bizarro word. It's like the opposite, of what I feel like we experience in America. And what it did is it showed me sort of what it looked like to experience privilege in another place, right? I remember saying to the guys, I was like, oh, is this what you feel like all the time? You know what I mean? Where everywhere you see yourself, everybody who's in charge and who's got power is represented by you. And to some extent, the people who see you believe the best of you, right? Like you get the benefit of the doubt. There's this same as me bias that kind of works, right? When you see people who look like you, you believe that they do things the same as you. And so you have a kind of bias that they're doing good things, as opposed to seeing somebody who's different, which of course in Kigali, what we saw in Rwanda is they had like this white person who was the cyberbullying. It was really fascinating. But so that's one thing of privilege. I've even experienced black privilege before. I was driving really fast through this somewhat rural area outside of the town that I live in. And my wife and I were driving back from, I don't know, a wedding or something. And we get pulled over, and of course I'm freaking out. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm out in this rural area. I got my white wife with me. This is gonna be a problem. What's gonna happen? I go through all the things, I put my hands outside the window. I'm, ready, And up walks this black dude, this black police officer to the window. And what's funny is he looks at me, he sees me, and he leans in and he's like, he kind of looks around and he's like, brother, what are you doing speeding out here? And so we had this conversation where he was like, look, man, you can't be out here looking the way you do and speeding, right? Like I'm the only black police officer in this area, and not everybody's going to treat you the way I'm going to treat you. And ultimately, we had a good conversation. He found out his wife was white and he had lived out there for whatever. He's the only black police officer on the force. And he sent me off with a warning. He said, man, don't come through here like that again. You're not going to promise to get me the next time. And so he walked away. I remember turning to my wife and I was like, I think I just experienced black privilege. This is amazing, right? Is this what you feel like all the time, right? Like it's the same thing. So privilege can be had. Privilege is not just a white thing. Like privilege is just an inevitability, really, in society. I mean, everybody, I think, understands if you travel to a foreign land, right, that the people who live in that foreign land are going to have privileges that you don't, right? And partially it's because they just have been there longer. They know things. They know about the customs. They know the language. They know the culture. This competency of these things allows them to move with more confidence throughout the environment because they don't have to worry about violating customs because their customs are their customs, right? If you go to India, and you're not Indian, you're not going to be a part of the privileged group. The Indians are going to be a part of the privileged group. That's just how privilege works. It's a large group experience. I mean, think about it in America. There's a religious privilege. There was a time where I was working with an interfaith group in a town not too far from where I live, and they were trying to figure out their meeting schedule, and we were getting towards December, and one of the folks who was leading the meeting, they were like, okay, so we usually meet on the fourth, Thursday of the month, but that Thursday is going to be Christmas this in December, so we won't meet, and one of my Jewish friends raised their hand. They're like, well, we're not celebrating Christmas. Why do we not meet? Y'all didn't meet when we had y'all met when we had Rosh Hashanah. We didn't move those meetings. And I kind of sat back and I was like, that's an example of religious privilege. So again, another example, right? Now, let me take it down to even a more base version, just to help us, again, to kind of set this thing that privilege is kind of an inevitability, right? In your house, right? Let's do it in my house. In my house, I've got two sons. These sons have privileges that people who don't live in the house don't have, right? So I talk a lot in Threaded, like we want to build relationships cross-culturally where people have refrigerator rights, right? So what I mean by that is you got such good friends with people who are different than you. They come into your house and they know that they can just go into the fridge. They don't have to ask you, right? That's how deep a friendship is, refrigerator rights. Now, I've got a lot of refrigerator right friends, but even these friends, right? I have friends that I've known for 30 plus years. Even these friends don't have the same privileges as my sons. Like my sons, if they want something from my bathroom, they just walk in and start getting stuff, right? And as much as I love my friends who have refrigerator rights and who I've known for 30, 40 years, they don't get to just come into my bathroom. Like it's just not the way it works. So again, my sons have Lloyd privilege, right? When they maneuver in my house, they can just do things that other people cannot do. So you can see, like, I want to just neutralize this term of privilege so that we can talk about it and understand it without it becoming something that gets caught up in kind of a trigger form where people who are now talking about, let's say, white privilege, believe that there's something nefarious about white privilege, right? Like in an American country or in a country where the predominant or the majority of the people are white, there could be a potential for white privilege. And in America, that's actually the truth of it, is that there have been historically throughout the history of America policies that have been specifically designed to benefit white people. And in fact, what you can say is that the opposite side of the coin of any privilege, whether it be white privilege, Indian privilege, religious privilege, Lloyd privilege, the opposite side of any coin is that anybody who's not a part of that group is experiencing some kind of, it doesn't always have to be oppression in the very pejorative way of oppression, although I don't know a great way to say oppression in a good way, but it doesn't have to be as heavy as oppression, but they're not getting the same benefits as those who are part of the privileged group, right? And I think it's important for us to see that, right? Now, if we're going to define privilege generally, and we did a podcast on this several years ago called White Privilege Fact or Fiction. So if you haven't engaged with Colored Commentary, check out the Colored Commentary podcast. You can see that on any of your podcast places where you get your podcast. There's also, we'll talk about a little bit as well. We've got some series here. One of the series that we're looking at is Christianity in the Public Square. We'll talk about a little bit where we mentioned this in episode 4. But if you hear us in that, the way we kind of define privilege is ultimately this systemic valuing of specific groups over another, right? And in many times when but some specific groups, the reason that they're there are when they're there, they receive just being a part of the group membership that's being valued in some ways over another. Just being a part of that group membership gives you unearned assets and advantages. Again, just taking it back to the Lloyd privilege. There's just unearned. These cats didn't earn anything. They just got born into the Lloyd family, and so they have these unearned assets, right? They have an inheritance that they get. There's advantages. There's all kinds of things. So that's really how privilege looks, right? The systemic valuing of a specific group over another. Now, so I think we got a sense of kind of what privilege looks like. I think what makes the conversation around privilege really helpful is when we start to think about and talk about the stewarding of this privilege, right? And it's why I love going to the Bible, right? Because the Bible actually has so many great stories and that center, in many ways, center around someone in privilege stewarding their privilege for others, right? So much of the stories. Let me just give you a few so that you don't think I'm messing with you. Let's just go back to the beginning, if you will. When the Israelites were chosen, when the tribe of Abram, which would be called Abraham, were chosen, in chapter 12 of Genesis, ultimately, we see that they become God's people. Zechariah 8:8 talks about God as he engages with the Israelites. He's like, look, I will be your God, you will be my people, right? That is a statement of privilege, that God has a people. This people has special rights and privileges that other people may not get to experience. Now, they were supposed to be, again, they weren't just a special people, but they had a special responsibility. And so that's where they were supposed to kind of live into the privilege they had. The privilege they had is they had this deep connection with God. God, he resided with them. He tabernacled with them through the ark and through the temple. And so through this, that was a privilege, an Israelite privilege that came, right? So that's an example. You can look at the story of Joseph, which is in Genesis as well. And we see Joseph moves through the ranks and becomes like second hand to Pharaoh. And in this privileged position, when he gets this dream that there's this famine that's going to come, he is able to put into work this system of saving food that would last for 7 years, the 7 years of the famine. And in that position of privilege, he didn't just save the food for the people of Egypt, but rather it was food that it says that the entire world came and ate based on this, right? And so this is, again, Joseph using the privileged position he's in to help other people. You can continue to go down the list. There's I love when you get into Exodus, right? We're just moving through the Bible here, but Exodus has so many examples of it, particularly at the very beginning when you're in Moses' story. We know that at the beginning of Moses' story in Exodus that there is this political leader, the Pharaoh, that has put this oppressive law into order where Hebrew boys were being killed. And we have these acts of civil disobedience from Shifwa and Puah, the nurses who came and actually didn't kill Hebrew boys, and so there was a civil disobedience against the laws that were of that land. We see Moses' mother and his sister Miriam hiding Moses, right? Civil disobedience. But then we get to the privileged part where when Moses was floating down the river, he finds himself being picked out of the river by Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter has this privilege. She's in the castle. She's in the royalty. This is royal privilege. And so using her privilege, she saves the life of this Hebrew baby. And this Hebrew baby grows up in the castle with privilege, right? Moses himself is representing, again, you've got this group that is marginalized within the environment of Egypt, but Moses is living in the castle. And what the story seems to say that Moses is doing fine, right? Like he can stay in the palace, no problem. But he chooses to, over the course of the story, we see that he finally ends up choosing his privilege, his connection to the palace, his all that he gleaned and absorbed maybe from the palace as far as education and know-how and a comfortability or a access to the Pharaoh that other people inside of his marginalized group would not have. He chooses to use that privilege ultimately to guide the Pharaoh. I say he guides it, but God does it. But guide the Pharaoh to let his people go out of slavery, right? So that's a use of privilege. Another great example is Esther. Esther is a great example of how privilege works. I mean, she finds herself, because of abuse and all these other types of oppression, in the palace. And when it's time for when the edict is put forth that all Israelites and Jews would be killed, she herself, as a Jew, in her privilege in the palace, she stewards her privilege by going to her husband, the king, to ask for them to be spared, right? So she, again, uses her privilege, the stewarding of her privilege, right? Like, I could go on and on about how people steward their privilege throughout the Bible, and it's such an important piece. We see some of this, as much as we see the stewardship throughout the Bible, we see in the Old Testament, there's no greater version of stewardship, of privilege than Jesus himself, right? He's got messianic privilege. And what he does is he chooses to empty himself, really, of his privilege, right? This term kenosis, the emptying his divinity, if you will. Philippians talks about that Jesus made himself nothing, not seeing equality with God as something to be utilized or grasped, but rather he emptied himself, right, and made himself into a servant. And so this is Jesus, right? He lived in the ultimate golden gated community, if you will, and he left this golden gated community to live in the most marginalized place, which is on earth. And then when he came to earth, instead of taking on the power position of a king or a pharaoh inside of earth's power structure, he chooses to be a part of one of the most marginalized groups in the area, right? He's the product of a teen pregnancy. He lives has to escape as a refugee and live as an immigrant. When he returns, he goes and lives in Nazareth, which many of the Jews in that time would say, what good can come out of Nazareth, right? So he exists inside. So he stewards his privilege in such a way as he becomes like us. But what he does is he then uses his connection to the Father to be a conduit for us to be connected to the Father, right? He's the bridge, as many times people talk about, the bridge to it. He uses himself, his privilege, where we are imbued with his presence and his person on us, so that almost like a lanyard that you would put on yourself, right? Like if you were going to a concert, a VIP concert, and you go in there and the reason you get into this is because somebody has given you the VIP pass. I think about this when I had a friend of mine who has some fame, and he took me to an event. And when we got to the event, we went through the back, this very secret entrance, but when he didn't have a lanyard, he just walked up and they were like, "Oh yeah, sir, come on in." And then when I walked up, they're like, "Hold on." And then they took a lanyard and they put it on me that said his name on it, so that I could maneuver freely throughout the spaces that I went. Right? That is stewarding privilege. That's what Jesus does, is he gives us this lanyard of righteousness in such a way that we can now have access to be heirs to be fellow heirs with him of God, and then also have access to God himself. Right? So that's how privilege is stewarded through the Bible. And so I think even today, as we think about stewardship, as we think about privilege, there's this opportunity, if we can be honest with ourselves, to recognize privilege when we have it, right? And as I've already ascribed to the word privilege, like there's lots of different ways that privilege, manifests itself. In our society, in a racialized society like America that has had a history of racial injustice and racial oppression, that's specifically, again, around racial categories, skin color, things of that nature. When you talk about the idea that there is a white privilege, a way in which people can show up who are white to places and have benefit of the doubt, much like, if you were in India, Indian person would have benefit of the doubt over a white person. In India, same thing in America. If you have white skin in many places, you can show up, and because you're a part of the majority, you can get benefit of the doubt. There are places where power is being held, and the predominant of that power is by people who have white skin. And so there's this power that still exists from being white, and there's this opportunity to steward it. And so we talk about that even a little bit if you have looked in our Christianity in the Public Square series through Color Commentary. In episode 4, we have a friend that comes on the show, Colin Packer, to talk with us about privilege a bit, or talk to us about really what it looks like and why people hesitate to enter the race conversation, particularly the systemic aspects. And he talks about this idea of working in the Capitol in Texas and looking at these bills and things that are going through. And one is this homeowner tax benefit. And I was really fascinated by this idea of, again, as a homeowner myself, this tax benefit, it privileges me, right? I have a homeowner privilege, and therefore when the tax bill comes, I get to benefit from that. And so this stewardship of our privilege, based on what we see, based on what we see in the Bible by many characters in the Bible and what we see with Jesus, is that in our privilege, we should be looking for ways to steward it to help others. In fact, I would say that's one of the really interesting specifics about what we see in the Bible, as I said earlier, about privilege, is that people, when they utilize it, or not all people, but there are ways when characters inside the Bible that we lift up even today, and we say, hey, these are great characters, right? The Esthers and the Josephs and so on. That when they have the privilege, they do choose to use it, not for their own protection, not for their own preferences, not for their own preserving, if you will, but rather they use it to help others. So privilege is a real thing. And I hope what you see in this time that we spent together, right, is that it's neutral. Everybody has access to it. But when you live in if you live in a particular area like America, there are privileges that exist here. And one of those privileges is white privilege. And much like any other privilege, right? If you have this privilege, the key to having that privilege, this gift to some extent, the key to making it and connecting it with something that is gospel driven is that you would use it to engage and to help those who maybe don't have access to the things you have, help them to have access to that, help them to have the resources that they need to be able to exist in this world in similar ways that you're existing. This is not like, hey, I'm using my privilege to make everybody rich, but no, I'm using my privilege to make sure that everybody is flourishing. See, this act of stewarding privilege for the flourishing of others is the textbook way that we reach what ultimately heaven is going to give us, which is shalom, where a society can reach this perfected version of peace, where everyone in the community can move forward with the great confidence that their needs, whatever those are, emotional, material, financial, whatever those needs are, that they would be met and that everyone would have what they need. And that as they as they utilize their privilege and steward their privilege to help others, that they're not losing anything, because the society will always be there to catch them if they get into a situation where their privilege doesn't get them what they need. So that's the conversation on privilege as we think about it. Again, we've had a longer conversation about this. If you want to go back to Color Commentary, check out on your Spotify, your iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can go back to the episode, first season, that is White Privilege Factor Fiction. We have a guest, Amanda Giordano, who is someone who teaches and trains at the college level around privilege, and particularly white privilege. And you'll find some even more technical things there. But I hope I hope this helped you kind of think through privilege in very anecdotal and also very biblical ways as well. So that's privilege through an anecdotal and a biblical lens.